Starting seeds is a fairly straightforward process, but there are a number of things that still lead people to experience failure. In this video, we're going to cover a few tips to hopefully ensure your next attempt is successful. So lighting is probably the number one place that a lot of people go wrong, and the way that you'll see results of this is through stretched or leggy seedlings, where they have very long stems, they're very pale in color, and they just don't seem quite right. Now this happens when you just do not have adequate light, or you have adequate light but it's just not close enough to your seedlings. You do not necessarily need to have lights in order to start seedlings. You can start them using a south-facing window. But if you have a north-facing window, or if you're relying on a skylight or any other light that may have any diffusing filters, shades, canopies, overhangs, things outside that may cause it to become dappled light and not strong direct light, you're probably going to experience some failures. Now the way around this is to use indoor grow lights, but where a lot of people also go wrong there is they do not have enough grow lights for the number of seedlings that they are starting. So one of the cheapest options is to buy a light bulb that will screw into an existing light fixture, and then you can mount that in, say, a task lamp and direct it onto your seedlings. But that light typically is only going to be adequate enough for one plant, one mature plant. It may do a few seedlings in a starter tray, but once those become larger, it's just not going to be enough. Otherwise, if you're using grow lights, oftentimes they need to be incredibly close to the plant to be giving off enough light, enough energy for those plants to be using. And if you have it too far away, the plants are going to be stretching and reaching, trying to access that light. So by bringing it down, making sure that your external output of the light in the form of lumens is strong enough for the amount that you have. If you're trying to use one light to cover a large spread, it may be that it's just not enough output. So you need to double check the lumens on the packaging that came with your lights against how many seedlings that you may have. Temperature is another concern. So for us, I am starting mine in the furnace room. The furnace room tends to run a little bit warmer than other areas in the basement, and the lights that we use as well generate a lot of heat, to the point where I often need to set up a fan just to keep the air moving and to make sure that it doesn't get too hot in here for them. But if you do not have enough heat, certain seeds will not germinate properly, as they do require that extra love of heat. So people will often use heat mats to get that started. But if you have enough light and enough sunlight, you should have enough heat where you do not need to invest in an additional heat mat. One thing I had touched on was airflow. Making sure that your seedlings have air that is moving around and circulating, that's not getting damp and heavy and stagnant, is also very important to prevent any mold or fungus diseases that may be appearing in your soil and on your seedlings, but also to help strengthen them and prepare them for when they do get moved outside. A lot of times you'll find that they're very fragile looking, very weak, and that's because they're not having to experience any resistance, and they're not building up any muscles to be able to counteract that. So by having a gently circulating fan, keeping the air moving, you don't want to blast your seedlings with any air, but just generally keeping it moving will be one more step that you can give them before bringing them out to harden outside and get them adjusted to the outdoor conditions that they're going to be facing for their final resting place. The other thing that a lot of people will do is use the seedling starter trays, and there is nothing wrong with seedling starter trays. Just in my experience, it means one additional step, more effort, and it also is a bit of a misguidance when it comes to the amount of space that you have available. Say your seedling tray has 120 little cells within it. You're like, yeah, you've got 120 different plants started. Those 120 plants can't stay in there for very long. Once they sprout, that tray is only going to last maybe 1 to 2 more weeks for you before they need to be upplanted into larger containers. So after making that mistake many years over and starting way too many seeds and not having the space to then put them, I now just start mine directly into a 3 or 4 inch cell tray. And that way, this is its final size. There's no upplanting, there's no additional steps, there's no risk of damaging the roots in that transplanting process either. And I just have to thin the seedlings as you sow multiple seeds in one to ensure germination rate. So it is less work long term, and it really does help you gauge your space better, and therefore your lighting for that space, because you already know how much space you're going to need for the final quantity of seedlings that you're going to have, and you don't all of a sudden become overwhelmed by having too many seedlings. When starting your seeds, the other thing to keep in mind is pre-moistening the soil. Many times potting mixes or seedling starting mixes, it's very light, very fluffy, but also very dry. And when you do start to moisten it, the water will just trickle right through it. It doesn't absorb right away. So if you have put your soil dry directly into your trays and then put your seed into that and then put your water on that, your seed will not stay at the depth that you planted it. It may move around in the pot, it may float up to the surface, it may get pushed down towards the bottom of the pot, and it will no longer be at the ideal planting height that it should be at in order to ensure success. And it may burn out of energy before it ever reaches the surface of the soil if it's got pushed down too far. Or if it's too high, it may not have the protection that it needs in order to germinate successfully. So the easy way to resolve that is simply by pre-moistening your soil before you put it into the cells, or pre-moistening it in the cells, making sure that it's all absorbed, and then putting your seed and then giving it one final water. Now my preference is to water from the bottom for my seeds. All of my seeds here I keep in a tray, and I will just pour the water directly into the tray and allow that to wick up into each of the trays naturally, and the airflow and the light, all of that will assist in that process. Timing is probably my biggest error to date. I do it wrong almost every single year. Winter is chugging along, I'm bored, I'm itching to start, can't wait to get my hands in the dirt, and I start my seeds in mid-March. This may not be a problem depending on when you can plant, but for me, the planting time is typically that I use is still going to be around the May 2-4 weekend, even though for my area, the Farmer's Almanac has the last frost date as the first week of May. But if I've started my seeds mid-March, I end up with 2-foot tall tomato plants in my house, and hardening those off, transferring them inside outside is incredibly difficult. They become huge and they take over, and if anything, they outgrow these as well, and then you are upplanting again, and what you're upplanting them to is just massive, and very few people have the space and the light requirements for that, unless you've only started 1 or 2 tomatoes, but who does that? So making sure that you time your seedlings correctly is incredibly important, and it is better to have seedlings that are small versus seedlings that are too large. Smaller seedlings that are younger will actually transplant better than an older, more mature plant. It's going to experience a lot more transplant shock at that transfer than a smaller plant would, and it's going to spend more time and more energy recovering versus growing and producing than that small little plant will. So that small little plant may even overtake and be more fruitful for you than that big plant was. So making sure that you're timing your seeds correctly is ideal. For me this year, it's about mid-April right now, early to mid-April, and I'm just getting my seeds going, which is a bit later for certain things like peppers that take quite a long time to germinate. But because I'm not going to be planting it out towards the end of May, and because we're also expecting an addition to the family at the beginning of May, I know I'm not going to have the time to get them out at the beginning of the month. So it works for me in my schedule this year, but making sure that you hit that timing right and you do not have these overgrown plants in your house is very important. And lastly, there are certain plants that like being started indoors and certain plants that do not like it. You can grow anything indoors. You can start any seed indoors, but not all plants respond to transplanting. So certain plants like root vegetables, the root is your produce. The root is what you are going to be harvesting. So if you damage that root in the process of transplanting, which odds are you may end up doing, you're not going to harvest anything. So unfortunately, all that time, all that effort, all that hydro and water and everything else that you've put into that plant inside could all just go to waste in that moment of transplant. So root vegetables are much better sown directly outdoors, and many of them are also cold tolerant, such as your carrots or your beets or your radishes. You can do those directly outside in April, sometimes even in March if your soil conditions are correct already, and save that space inside. Other ones are ones that just grow really, really fast, such as corn. And corn doesn't transplant well either, but it also gets massive really quickly, and you just have nowhere to keep it inside your house. So that's another one that's better direct sowed outside. Anything that is a vining, so your squashes or your cucumbers, even zucchini, any of the squashes, melons, all of those do better outside direct sow. They also are not fans of transplanting. You can transplant them, you just may not have the best success, and they're happier just put in their final position, even if it means putting a little cloche over top of them through a juice jug or something else. The other problem with starting vining vegetables indoors is that they are unruly and they take over and they begin to interfere and mingle in with all of your other plants because they grow really, really fast. Starting those outside will free up real estate for the plants that actually need the light, actually need that extra boost where our growing season isn't long enough, such as tomatoes or peppers, and other really heat-loving plants. The other one for this is leafy vegetables or leafy greens. Your cut and come again varieties, they grow so fast and they are fairly cold tolerant and they don't transplant that well, so to waste precious real estate indoors starting them is really not worth it. The offset to that is going to be lettuces such as a romaine lettuce or a head lettuce of some sort. Those ones you can definitely start indoors because it's one individual plant. You're not cutting it, coming back to it again. It's your plant spacing also matters more for those. So those ones you can start indoors versus direct sowing and not waste your efforts. So I hope these tips may have shed some light onto any existing conditions that you have that were not ideal, that may have been causing you to experience seedling failure up to this point, and that you can take these into account and maybe change how you've been doing things and have better success this year. If you do start seedlings this year and you have the space, your environment is suited to it, it would be awesome if you could grow a few extra seedlings to share with family and friends, as many of the nurseries are not operating as they normally would due to the current economic situations. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more Canadian gardening videos, then make sure to hit that subscribe button and I will see you in the next video.